Okay, hello everyone. I'm joined with Lewis from Perspective Philosophy. So today we're going to be debating whether or not morality is objective. I take the position that it's subjective. You're going to argue for the position that it is objective.
Yeah.
And yeah, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I've been watching a few of your debates. I've watched your Destiny debate. I've watched your debate with, I think it was Corneville. And from what I gathered, like I saw your position with Corneville, and when you started talking about subjective morality, he put you into a place of arbitrariness. So, and I think you even just discussed this with Ask Yourself Afterwards, where you agreed that all moral systems are in some way arbitrary.
Yeah, to
Um,
some extent.
yeah,
You can like arbitrarily choose base fundamental axioms just on something as simple as personal preference. So I
yeah.
could just personally prefer to value intelligence over sentience. So a more intelligent being deserves more of a right to life than a less intelligent being, but so it's arbitrary in that way.
So why would you choose sentience?
I choose sentience because that's just what I value most personally. I'd say without sentience, there's no point in actually having any kind of moral systems or values because without sentience, then there's no ability to experience things like well-being. And
Yeah,
if you
I
can't
see.
experience well-being, then what's the point? Like
Yeah,
the point of a moral system is
you. I
essentially
mean,
to improve well-being.
sorry. I see what you're saying, but that's assuming that the point of the moral system is to improve well-being. The point of the moral system
Well,
could be
right.
to improve a selfish desire. So, for example, a rational egoist might turn around and say, "Well, actually, I have no. I think destiny pretty much did this to you. Actually, he pretty much gave you a situation where he's like, I don't care about animals. I don't even care about disabled people. I don't even care about anyone who can't adhere to a social contract." In that case, you're left with pretty much two contrasting wills, and you can't say that his position is any less valid than your own, but his position
Um,
was.
you can like again this like it really comes down to what you value, and like really morality occurs in a social context. So like if you're living in a society, the society is going to value certain things above certain other things. So moral systems don't necessarily have to value well-being. It could value just pure survival. It could value some other like type of belief, but it really comes down to what the majority of people value. And if the majority of people want their like a moral system to accomplish some sort of goal or have some sort of utility, um there is a level of arbitrarity there, but you're like the society is going to decide for itself what it values most. And in that context, you can say that a certain moral system is superior to another because like if the society values well-being above anything else, well, okay, a moral system that takes away human rights, causes suffering, kills people, obviously it's going to be not as good as a moral system that values well-being.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. The only issue I have there though is, well, the issue I really have is, from what I'm gathering, is that your position is that you hold the moral axioms of your culture and your society. Is that correct?
Um, that's that's sort of true. Like, I mean, there is a level of individuality. Like, there's individuals who like hold different values than from the rest of their culture. But again, like moral systems have to be agreed upon, or else they won't work. So the majority of society has to agree on certain moral systems, and then that's how they function.
Yeah, I agree that it's like ethics is a institutional system that has to affect all of society, otherwise it wouldn't function properly. The issue then is that it could be just used for societal cohesion, as you say. So, as a society that we live in now, why should we change our normative structure to include animals?
Well, again, it's basically because it follows along logically from the idea of human rights. If you're going to say that humans deserve a right to life, they deserve to be treated well because of like some sort of value, like or some trait you value, like sentience, intelligence, or something like that, then it just follows along logically to animal rights as well, because they also possess some of the same traits, behaviors that we do.
Okay, so what if, rather than sentience being valued in human rights, as you say, what if instead human rights was simply to value oneself and to protect oneself from other people? So I do not want my human rights to be violated just as you don't. So that would be a contractarian stance. So as a as an animal, they can't sign the social contract, they can't be part of it, they can't adhere to the social normative structure, they don't pose a threat. So I don't have to take them into consideration. So when I'm placed in that position, there's no reason for me to take your subjective position over my own. Can you say that I
Well,
ought to do it?
Well, I could argue for why you should, but if you're going to hold a position like that and that's your belief, then I can argue like up and down, like, okay, well, you should value this thing because they're also living beings. They feel the same way you do. Would you want to be treated like that in that situation? Like, I could make all these arguments, and I could even make practical arguments like, okay, well, animal agriculture harms human beings, it damages their health,
Yeah.
our environment. I can make all those sorts of arguments, but if like at the end of the day you're just going to like value certain things and prefer a certain moral system, like that's just going to come down to your own personal preference. And we don't even have to put this in like an animal context here, like an animal rights context. Like we could put this in like a minimum age of consent. Some people think the minimum age of consent should be 14. People think it should be 16. Some people think it should be 18. You can't really claim, you can't really make a strong objective claim like, okay, well, this should be the minimum age of consent. Like, it's going to come down to a lot of different things, like just what you personally value. And that's what a lot of these moral systems come down to. It literally just comes down to personal preference a lot of the time. So you do make base fundamental like axioms, but from there, it follows along like things follow along logically from there. So I can say I really value well-being. Well, I can't really argue any further that like why you should value well-being. That's just a base fundamental axiom that I value. But following along from there, there's a lot of huge benefits when you value well-being. So it protects yourself, protects other people in the society. So there's a practical utility there, but you can't really claim that it's objective.
You see, I think you can claim it's objective, and I think that this is the difference because once we hit the underlying principles, like let's say well-being, what's founding those principles is either the subjective self, in which case it's something that's emanating from, let's say, my culture, my nature, or even just my just general desires, wherever they come from, or it can come from an absolute right, and the greater good. Now, what I would say in the case of the age of consent, I would take a Hegelian moral philosophy, a Hegelian philosophical approach to that. So Hegel criticized Kant. Kant tried to say that objective morality was rationally provable, so that I could come to a priori moral duties. I could found what my duty would be purely through reason. Hegel said that that was nonsense because unless we have a cultural context, it's meaningless. What is respect without culture? Because we might shake our hands in the Western Hemisphere, but then we might bow in the Eastern. So like we'll have different approaches to the actualization of these a priori moral principles. Nevertheless, they still exist in one point or another. The issue is the end point of reason. So it's not that we cannot determine what is good and right. Because, for example, when we say that valuing well-being is important because it stops us from hurting, and it stops other people from suffering as well, then what we've understood is that they both me and you and any other sentient being has a value interaction with the world. That value interaction with the world is an innate good or bad. I think Jeremy Bentham says, we are ruled by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Now, these are experiences in which have innate value. We can't feel them ourselves sometimes when we're with another person, but we can understand that these have value to that being. So once we understand that point, and we understand that pain and pleasure is the foundation in which our reason can understand, then the age of consent comes from, okay, the underlying principle is that we need to respect innocence because the violation of innocence would harm a sentient being. And so to prevent said harm, we prevent them from predatory attacks from, other individuals and manipulation and coercion. And these are conceptual growths from baseline moral concepts, which have been founded through what I would call perceptual reasoning. This is a term coined by Murdoch, in which our values, which we already hold, are tested against reality. And this means that they're tested against an empirical principle, an empirical value. So this means that our moral systems wouldn't be underpinned by pure reason, but by a practical reason. Kant called this a priori synthetic. So it's when you test your reason against the world and you come to an understanding of whether it's actually true, objectively true. Now, the reason I'm saying that this is an objective stance is because it's the culmination of the subjective individual's experiences. And that is a greater good. It's a democratic good.
Okay, the problem I have with claiming that you can you can determine something as objectively good or objectively bad is, again, you're coming up with base fundamental axioms like well-being matters. And for the majority of sentient beings, well-being matters to them personally, but that doesn't mean well-being is an objective good. Again, that's going to come down to personal preference. You can actually find people who don't give a fuck about well-being. You could take a look at some psychopaths you can meet. They literally don't value fucking anything. They completely lack things like empathy. So if we had like a society of psychopaths, you could say that, okay, well, if the entire society was psychopathic, didn't care about each other at all, didn't give a fuck about anyone's well-being, and they just killed, raped, and murdered each other, that would negatively impact everyone's well-being. But that doesn't mean well-being is an objective moral good. Again, you have to value that base axiom. And from there, you can claim that certain things are objectively good within within that framework. If you're going to just assume well-being is good and something that you should value. So if I just say, okay, well, well-being is the fundamental axiom for which I determine morality. I could say, okay, well, punching a baby in the face is morally bad because it negatively impacts its well-being. But you can just throw away well-being. Yeah. So I agree with you on some level, but I don't think that's actually evidence that morality is objective. You can create a framework, like some base fundamental axioms like well-being matters. And then from there, you can say, okay, well, this is objectively morally good or morally bad if we start from that axiom. But you can't really prove that axiom is like an objective truth.
I think I can. I think the reason that when we say that these base moral axioms, for example, like well-being, if they were coming from a subjective place, I would say that we could dismiss them on a whim, in the sense that if a psychopathic society decided, okay, we don't want well-being, we'll just get rid of that. Yeah, they probably could. But the society that they create, that raped, murdered, and pillaged, and whatever else they did, would still have a fundamental negative value compared to a society that actually cared about well-being, because the suffering of the sentient beings within that society would be greater. So each and every sentient being.
You're just creating this base fundamental axiom that well-being matters, and that's the problem I have. I think we agree that if we create these base fundamental axioms, you can objectively prove whether something is moral good or a moral bad. But my issue here with your reasoning is that you're claiming that you can prove objectively that the that these base fundamental axioms are like correct. Like you should value these.
No, I do think that, because I think that once you've reached a point in which you can, let's say you compare and contrast to society. So I think, ask yourself, I think he loves that infinitely sentient beings, can we just holocaust them all kind of thought experiment. I think I've heard him say that a few times. And I think you gave the example of an intelligent alien species who are more sentient than us. So what we have to understand when I call them the end points of reason is that all of these individuals have a subjectivity and have a preference to the world. They're able to feel pain and they're able to feel pleasure. Now, these are the fundamentals for which we treat them. So when I treat you, if I don't want you to feel pain, but you're a sadomasochist and you actually really like I don't know, a type of pain that I'm not aware of, then my actions towards you will be relatively different.
Right.
So, like, I'm not dismissing cultural relativism, because actualization of moral principles is, of course, different. But the underlying principle behind that is that you have a preference. There is a preference that will be great, that you'll prefer one type of society to another. Now, the best society is one that adheres to the most vital preferences within individuals at the most, and then to a lesser degree increases the most, allows for the greatest subjectivity. So an example would be all of our preferences are based on life. Without life, we can't have a value interaction with the world. So the best society would be a democratically because we would be a democratically adhered to good. So a society with two people who are alive is better than a society with one person who's alive and with the added desire that they also got to eat the other. So the value of an animal's life is greater than the value of our pleasure, and we've hierarchized pain and pleasure responses. Now that's something that is actually empirically provable to some degree. I mean, we can ask people how they feel about certain preferences. That's one way to determine it. And we can even have pain scales like we do with certain, like, bullet ants to, various other stings and so on like that. But we can also have neurological responses. These are objectively provable claims on the world. So long as that these individuals can have a value interaction, the greatest value interaction from all beings in society produces the best society objectively. And for that, we can say that there are certain fundamental principles that we should adhere to. So well-being will produce a society in which we protect our fundamental interest of life.
Okay, I think I see the mistake you're making here. Just because something is universal, so universally we agree that we want to value well-being, that doesn't actually make it objective. You can have something that's universal and subjective. So yeah, I mean, you could ask everyone in society, well, would you rather live in a society that values well-being and more people are alive, more animals get to live, and everyone experiences a better overall life, or would you rather live in a society where everyone suffers and is miserable? Well, they can like everyone would universally say, okay, well, I'd prefer the society where I get to live, I have great well-being and shit. That doesn't make it objective. It just makes it universal.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there, except my point would be that even if everyone in society did agree that, let's say everyone in society agreed on slavery, for example, a better society would be one without slavery, because it would increase the subjective experience of all individuals involved. So animals, for example, in this case, are incapable of, actually showing their value interaction with the world. But humans in the past, even when they wish, let's say, to be dominated, let's take a Middle Eastern country where they've been indoctrinated, I can say that their values, their subjective experience, their ideological stance is flawed. And the ideological stance is flawed because a better society would allow for a greater subjectivity and expression of desire on all individuals within society, and hierarchized value structures, which essentially promote the most important values, which we would say underpin all subjective experience. So life and liberty are are vitally important for a society that can have any real subjective experience. So, for example, if we allowed murder or slavery, we would have a worse society, regardless of whether individuals thought it was okay to have murder or slavery.
Okay, I'm kind of seeing some circular reasoning here. Like, I'm asking you, why are these base fundamental axioms, like valuing well-being, why are they objective? And then you say, well, because it enhances well-being. Okay, and then I ask you, okay, well, why is well-being like why is valuing well-being a fundamental objective truth about morality? And then you say, well, because it enhances everyone's well-being.
Oh, I see what
So
you're
you're
saying.
kind
I
of
see what you're
going
saying.
around in a circle a bit.
Yeah, the reason I'm saying that is because we all value innately our own well-being. Levinas says
Sure, we
that
do.
that
But
we
again,
stop. No, but even we'll not say well-being. We'll not say well-being as a axiom. I mean that we'll all value our preferences, that will have a value interaction with the world. So that's not necessarily any particular principle. That might, if we're a murderer, we value murder. Okay,
right.
so what I'm saying is that every individual values their own life, their own liberty, and then any other desire that can spin from that point on.
Well,
Now, the best
well, again,
society is
well,
the
again,
society.
the problem is something can be universal but be subjective. So you can't just say, well, this is universal, so therefore it's objective. You can have something that's universal and subjective.
Oh, I agree. I'm not saying that that's the point. I'm saying that there can be a society in which individuals have created um, let's say a law, even institutional normative structures, ethical structures that are flawed and that can be shown to be flawed, because a better society would allow each and every individual to experience for themselves a better life. Some individuals may experience less pleasure, but overall, the greater good, which we can call utility, would be higher.
Well, I'm not arguing with you that there's a utility in having moral systems. But again, you have to just have base fundamental assumptions, essentially, that well-being matters, that it's a good thing to live, that it's a good thing to not suffer.
You see, I would
So,
say that the only thing that you have to have is that you wish to avoid suffering yourself, and that
right.
equally to you, so do all other sentient beings.
Well, right, but like again, that's just universal. That doesn't make it actually objective.
Yeah, but it's objective in the sense that um it's outside of yourself. Whether I wish to dismiss your ability to feel pain or pleasure, I can't. And the better outcome objectively from both of us is the point in which we both feel more pleasure and less pain.
Okay, wait. What do you mean by outside of yourself?
So by outside of the self, I would mean that if we were taking a God's eye view, even, right, and we were to see a society that had, let's say, actually, let's just not even say a society. Let's say there was two individuals. One wanted to murder the other. The better outcome for that situation outside of both individuals would be if both survived, because their desire for life is of an infinite weight to themselves, as it predicates all of their other interests rationally, and because of that.
Not necessarily rationally.
Oh, I wouldn't
Again,
say so.
that's well,
I think Kant showed that.
no, it's not necessarily rationally. Like there are people who want to live and there are people who would prefer to die. Like
Okay,
again, this comes down to personal preference.
let's take people who want to die. Can you want to die while being dead? It's like the whole. That's what Kant kind of shows. It's like it's irrational to want to die because your preferences can never be actually fulfilled. Because once you're dead, you can never actually have fulfilled your preferences.
Well, no, like again, the problem here is, okay, let's say I'm a god and I'm just looking down on some society I have no relation to. And I'm just like an outside observer. Okay, well, there's two people here who want to live and coexist. There's two people here who want to murder each other. Which is the better circumstance? Again, you're just you have to just bootstrap on some fundamental axioms like, okay, it's better to live than to die. It's better to experience pleasure than to suffer. So again,
well, take pleasure and suffering. I don't think that so long as that were true to the definition of suffering, can we say that it is ever better to suffer? Because take a masochist who hurts themselves. That's really just a differentiation between pleasure. That's another type of pleasure.
Well, like, that's basically, you're getting into like a word game there. Like,
no, I don't mean, no, that's what I'm saying.
Well, I mean,
I'm trying to avoid.
Well, yeah, I mean, just by pleasure, I mean something that you enjoy, like get enjoyment out of, essentially. Like, okay, sure, I like being whipped in my back.
Yeah.
Technically, that's like suffering, but it's like a good
it's
type
a pleasure
of
response. Yeah.
So,
Cool.
So that's basically what I'm saying. So it's better to feel pleasure than to suffer. But again, you're just like bootstrapping on some fundamental axioms first, and they're fundamental assumptions about morality. But from there, they might get an outcome that you want. So you want to live personally. You want to feel pleasure personally. But again, that's subjective. And it could be universal. Every single living being on the planet can want to live, can want to feel pleasure, can want to avoid suffering, but that doesn't make it not subjective. Just because something's universal, that doesn't make it objective.
No, but the difference is that regardless of their desires in which they are acquainted to, there is a purified, which I think Hegel calls a purified stance, in which there is a greater good for all of those individuals. And that is the objective stance that we need to reach. So,
explain greater good.
So the greater good would be a greater value interaction from all sentient beings. So if I want to live and you want to live, then a society that provides you with a right to life and me with a right to life will innately benefit us.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, if we value our lives, if we value our lives, if we value well-being, then that is objectively true. But that doesn't make certain actions, like certain moral actions, objectively good or objectively bad, because again, you're just bootstrapping on some fundamental axioms. And then we get into this like circular line of reasoning. Okay, well, why should well-being be valued? Well, it's because sentient beings value well-being. Okay, but that doesn't make it actually objective. Then you say, okay, well, it's objective because sentient beings value well-being. And then we get into the other argument about how just because something isn't universal, just because something is universal doesn't mean it's objective. So I can agree with you on a certain level that, okay, well, pretty much all sentient beings value their lives and value well-being. And if they value those things, then it makes perfect logical sense to value well-being. But again, that doesn't actually make well-being an objective good. It just means every sentient being subjectively values well-being. And from there, we can make inferences that certain actions are morally good or certain actions are morally bad from that base fundamental assumption.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, but I would argue that even if, let's say, you wanted to die, that your preference was only possible because of your life, because you're alive. So what predicates all of your desires is your conscious existence, which is your sentience.
Okay.
That is your base value and your equality with me. We are both sentient and we can have a value interaction with the world. Any preference past that point can vary. That can become more arbitrary. But your life has innate value to you regardless of whether you value your life or not. Because even your desire to die is predicated by your sentience.
Sure.
Yeah.
I still don't. Okay.
So what I'm saying is that once we hit that point of equality, then your preferences and my preferences can then be roughly compared to create a greater overall utility, which will then allow us to create fundamental principles and axioms. And it's that which allows us to produce these
Okay,
axioms.
wait.
So,
I think you're
so
going in reverse direction here. So you're saying,
yeah.
explain that last sentence again.
So rather than well-being being creating our value predicates any moral principle, and then we create those moral principles based on our subjective interactions with each other.
Okay.
If you like, I think I've got a quote from Levinas, which may put it in a nicer kind of way. If you like to hear it.
Sure.
Yeah, he says. Let's find it. I put it in the wrong bloody place.
Because the problem I have here is you're kind of following along from backwards reasoning, because if you're going to claim, okay, well, achieving a certain utility is a moral good, like the utility of enhancing well-being, prolonging life, well, to even get there in the first place, you have to value some sort of fundamental axiom. And again, that doesn't make it an objective
So why
truth.
should we value any particular axiom?
Well, because we have preferences.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that's an objective good. It just means everyone has their own subjective preference. And everybody could have the exact same subjective preference. That doesn't actually make it objective. Just because something is universal, that doesn't make it objective. So you're kind of going backwards here. It sounds like you're claiming that because we have these preferences that are universal, therefore it is an objective truth that we have to value something like well-being, when no, it's the opposite.
The
So
only thing you need to value to get to any particular moral axiom is sentience. And the reason you value sentience is simply because so long as you understand yourself, it's not necessarily that you wish to value it, it's that it has a value in and of itself, because that individual has its own value to itself, and it is equal to you in its ability to prescribe value onto the world phenomenologically.
So what you're trying to say is that because a being is sentient, it has a fundamental value to it, and because it has like a fundamental value, therefore it's an objective truth that well-being should be valued?
No. So what I'm saying is that, well, in the sense that the good of that being becomes an ethical statement when it resists the good of me. So, for example, if I wish to kill it, we then have a value interaction which clashes. So my value interaction with the world may be made greater by killing it, but its value interaction would be made by would be made lesser or totally annihilated. So in that case, the greater overall good would be the greatest ethical principle. The objectively good system would be one that provides the greatest subjectivity to me whilst maintaining that animal's good as well, or that individual's good as well.
Okay,
so that's that is a greater good. That is a democratic structure.
Well, again, we're just going back to this circular reasoning. Why do you value the subjective preferences of every being?
I value the subjective preferences of every being because they value themselves, and I'm not a god or any sort of ultimate prescription upon the world. So I don't get to choose where value comes from. I can only choose that I have value within myself, and I can understand that you have value within yourself. And so long as that we can understand that point, then we can say that you can have a good interaction and I can have a good interaction.
Well, again, how do you know that's objectively good? Like, again, you're just appealing to like
it's
the universal.
Good. It's objectively good because if you were to be a bystander to a society, the greater good would be the good of the greatest number of sentient beings to the highest extent.
Okay, but why is that good? Like,
It's good for them individually. That's why.
well, right. I understand that it appeals to their preference, but
No,
why
but
is
even if
that
it doesn't, like,
objectively good?
you can have something that doesn't appeal to their preference, but appeals to their overall um,
Well-being?
well-being.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, you're just bootstrapping that axiom. Like
No,
again, you're
because,
not proving
well,
that
what
axiom.
I'm saying, okay, well, what we're saying is that even if their preferences, let's say total subjectivity, let's say we were to say like their preferences of, I don't know, murder or slavery, they end
Sure.
up impeding upon another's. So what we have is that the greatest subjectivity creates the greatest society, and that's Hegel.
Okay, so let's say everybody had the preference, everyone had the preference where they wanted to murder. And if they couldn't murder, then they'd be absolutely suffering and everybody would want to kill themselves. So everybody would have to murder each other. What's the objective
Well, you've
moral good there?
basically given us like an absolute negative. There is no moral good there. That is ultimate hell.
Okay, but
Like,
why?
well, it's because you can either
It's
die
it's
or
because
kill.
it's
Yeah.
because you're bootstrapping on
No,
well-being.
because what you're saying is that you have, if I have a value of one and you have a value of one, and we have to self-annihilate or we'll kill ourselves, then what we've done is we've basically got a value of zero anyway.
Well, no, not necessarily. Like again, if people get pleasure out of murdering each other and it lets them extend their life, then you could argue, well, okay, if we're appealing to personal preference,
So you're saying
then
that
that
if there
is a
was
moral good.
so you're saying there was a society in which our we would actually kill ourselves if we didn't kill, if we didn't murder another sentient being, then the greatest good of that society would be um, to murder each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know
Okay.
what?
No, no, I would agree. I would agree. But then I would say that the better society would be the one in which we were restrained from killing each other.
Well, again, that's only because
No, objectively, because we would all, there would be a greater overall value democratically, because the greater good would then be increased. The utility of the society would be increased.
well, again, why do you value that
But I
utility?
don't need
Again,
to, I don't need to value it for it to be true. That's the point.
well, yes, you do.
No, no, I
Or
don't.
or at least the members of that society all have to value it. And again, that's
No,
only
no, no.
because you're bootstrapping on fundamental axioms like
No, no, I don't.
well-being.
The greatest experience for all those members of the society, regardless of their belief systems, is what matters. And so, if we could create a society, for example, which placed people into perfect harmony, it would be better overall. What we have to say is that if there was an ability to make everyone's subjective preferences adhered to simultaneously, then yeah, it would be the best society. But unfortunately, we can't get this. So what we do is we create an ethical system based on certain moral axioms that allow us to increase the overall utility of our society, and those principles underpin our actions.
Oh, okay, but here's where the circular reasoning comes in.
How is
So
that
the
circular reason?
no,
I don't
well,
know.
no, I'll explain. So the debate is about whether or not morality is objective.
Yeah,
So you're claiming that okay, well, morality is objective because it's good to serve the utility of well-being.
it's
Okay,
the
well,
common good.
why? Yeah, okay, so the common good. So, okay, then I ask you, well, why is it an objective moral truth that the common good is good? And then you say, well, because the common good is good. Then I ask you, okay, but why is the common good good? And then you say, because the
So
common good is
but the
good.
common, but the thing is, the reason I'm saying the common good is good, or at least better than the individual good, is it's the culmination of individual goods. So if I equal one and you equal one, then one plus one
It's
equals two, and
it
that is
it, it
essentially
leads
the
it,
hierarchizing of good.
it leads to the same thing. So then I ask you, why is the individual good good? And then you say because the individual good is good. And then you could just bring it to a
No,
higher level. Okay, well,
the individual good is good because I can have a positive or negative experience in the world based on my sentience,
yeah,
and that
and
can be
that's
empirically verifiable.
yeah, and again, that's personal preference. And like, even if this is universal, so a sentient being has the personal preference to live and experience well-being, that doesn't make it objectively good to
But what is
experience.
objectively good for the sentient being is its sentience. As you even said in the Ask Yourself debate, you all agreed that to
Well,
remove
yes,
sentience would harm that
that's
being, regardless, always.
that's where we agree. So that's where we agree. If we have these base fundamental axioms that well-being matters and sentience is an aspect of well-being, in order to experience well-being, you have to be sentient. And if you take away sentience from a creature, that goes against its well-being. Well, that is an objective truth because we've established that base fundamental axiom. So it's only objectively true within that framework, starting from the base fundamental axiom that sentience and well-being matters. But you can't go any further than that. You can't say, okay, well, the base fundamental axiom of well-being and sentience is objectively good. You just
See,
can't go any further than that, because
I
then
think
you
the
get
point in which you get,
totalitarian.
I think the point in which you get there is the fact that when life predicates all of our interests, even our interest to die is predicated by a value that is objective to ourselves.
Okay, like, again, now we're just at the point where you're saying, okay, because something is universal, therefore it's objective,
No, no,
which,
what I'm saying is that even if someone was ultimately suicidal, right, and they just wanted to die,
sure.
that it would be bad for them to die because all of their interactions with the world, unless it would create, I don't know, yeah, I would say that it was bad for them to die because if they die, they will have an overall nil experience. So long as they can have some pleasure, it's better than having no experience at all.
Okay, and
So
why
that's why
is
when you put us into a situation that when you say an infinite negative experience that would lead to would lead to suicide, well then we've got an infinite negative experience. But the better society
well,
would be one
well,
that would.
no, like, that's not necessarily an infinite negative experience. That's only an infinite negative experience based on your own preferences. So again, like, let's just say, hypothetically, there's like some kind of society where everyone has to murder each other, or else they can't experience any well-being. They get a tremendous amount of well-being from murdering each other. And if they can't murder, then they'll just die of absolute misery and kill themselves. Well, that's a society that just works against your own personal preferences, but those individuals have their own preferences. They want to murder each other. So again,
The argument there really, I think, comes down to the fact that they wouldn't have a society or even an ethical system.
well, it's a hypothetical. So
Yeah, I know it's a
whenever,
hypothetical, but I think that actually breaks down the ethics itself.
no, well, no, again, the point here is that just because something's universal, that doesn't make it an objective truth. So I'm just proving to you that you have your own preferences. Just because you have your own preferences, that doesn't make it an objective truth. Just because you have the preference of, like, not wanting to murder people to wanting to live yourself and experience well-being, that doesn't make well-being an objective moral truth. It just means
I think
as
I
a
can show
sentient being,
you.
you have your own preferences.
I think I can show you at least partly where I'm coming from. So take the individuals in this society who wish to, murder and pillage, and that brings them well-being. But they also wish for their own lives so that they can murder, kill, and gain well-being from that. Would you agree? They have to be alive to murder so that they can feel good.
Okay, wait, explain that again.
So the individuals in the society who get well-being from murdering,
Sure.
they all have to murder. They have to be alive to murder.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like,
because you can't do it when you're
I
dead.
guess,
Right?
well,
Yeah.
I guess you could make a murder robot, but I
Yeah.
guess,
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess the real, like, by the dictionary definition of murder, like a sentient being killing another sentient being, sure, okay, you have to be
So
alive to murder.
the individual's interest would then be to murder rather than kill themselves, yes? Because it's
Yeah,
innately better for the individual. So the societal interest, the overall ethical one, would be the society that murders rather than the society that kills itself.
sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that's true. But I'm
Okay,
saying that it's objectively true because their lives have been given an equally objective status within the overall utility. The utility of the situation is still higher. The arbitrary
Why
maxims
does the
and
utility matter?
utility matters because only because you matter to yourself. I mean, if we were trying to
Yeah,
give it
so
a
personal preference, and again, I told you personal,
yeah,
like
oh no, no,
even if everyone had the
I would
same
agree,
personal preference, that
but
doesn't make it universal or objective.
no,
Or
no,
sorry,
but like that.
things can be universal but not be objective.
But then we can say that they need two things at least in order to have any sort of value interaction with the world, which is life and liberty. So they need to be alive to have a will, and then liberty to express their will.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
so
don't
they are
understand.
objectively valuable um, predicates to all moral systems. You need life and liberty. So the greatest overall moral system is one that provides the greatest subjectivity for the overall population, regardless of their preferences.
Okay, like it seems like you're skipping a step here. Like, so you're saying just because a sentient mind exists, then therefore fundamental base axioms are objectively true, like well-being?
No, I'm saying that because, well, I guess what I'm saying is that it depends on what would you define as well-being. Let's just take that, like, just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing.
Okay, well, I guess the opposite of suffering, pleasure.
Okay, so pain and pleasure. Yeah, so I would say that so long as they can have a value interaction with the world, which is the basis of sentience, you can't be sentient and not feel pain or pleasure. Then yeah, I think that once we get to that point, pain and pleasure is valuable to that being. And then overall it becomes valuable to the society as the greatest the maximization of pain or minimization of pleasure. Maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain.
Okay, so let me try to string this together. So sentience is required to experience well-being, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we agree on that. Therefore, because sentience is required to experience well-being, that means well-being is objectively good?
No, since
Like,
sentience is required for well-being, yeah. But
sure.
sentience is that it is a feeling that the individual experiences, and that feeling innately has a value to that being for it to be sentience. Would you not agree? That is, for the value interaction in the world, sentience requires a value interaction with the world, good or bad.
Okay, so sentience is required to experience well-being. Well-being is good because it fulfills the interests of the sentient being.
Yeah.
Therefore,
The greatest
well, that's
well-being.
just circular reasoning. So,
Well,
well, no, let's go through it. So, sentience is required to experience well-being.
mhm.
Well-being fulfills the interests of the sentient being. Well-being is therefore good because it fulfills the
The
preferences of the
interest of the
sentient being.
sentient being. Yeah, but then you
That's
have to
circular.
understand that it's yeah, but it's founded on an empirical experience.
Okay, well, we can agree okay, let's just agree that sentience is like exists. It's an empirical experience. But again, just because something is universal, that doesn't actually mean it's objective. So
It's objective.
you've got you've got two problems here. For one thing, it's circular reasoning. When I'm asking you why is well-being objective, well, you say because it fulfills the interests of a sentient being. Okay, then I ask you why is it objectively good to fulfill the interests of a sentient being? Then you say because it fulfills the preferences of a sentient being. Then I ask you, well, why is it objectively good though? And then you say because it fulfills the interests of a sentient being. So you're going
Well,
around in a circle there.
I mean, the issue is we're
And
talking about
well,
the
no,
moral
wait,
foundations, aren't we? So
and the second problem you have is when you claim, okay, well, this is universal across like all sentient beings. Well, just because something is universal, that doesn't actually make it objective. So
no,
you're either claiming that universality makes something objective, which it doesn't, or you're just using circular reasoning.
no. What I'm saying is that you can have a society which has preferences, and yet those preferences do not meet the well-being interests of all the sentient beings. So a greater overall ethical system would be that which better allows the greatest value interaction from all sentient beings. So, for example, if we were a master race in a society with slaves and we could determine the moral code of our society, the better society would be the one that allowed the subjective expression of all individuals within it, because we innately value our own experience and they innately value their own, and our experiences are equal.
Okay, well, it's interesting you mentioned innately. Again, like just because something is universal, that doesn't make it objective. Like we can
Well,
actually talk
innately,
about, well, no, listen, we can actually talk about like a biological basis for morality. Like,
I
okay,
mean,
so
that's
there's,
pretty much. I mean, like when we talk about morality, there's no morality without anything being sentient in the first place. So it is.
well, right,
It has to
like
be
I mean,
biological to some degree.
yeah. So like just because something like is like exists biologically, so there is a reason why we come to moral systems like we do. There is a biological basis for it. Just
Yeah.
because there's a biological basis for it, that doesn't make it objective. Like again,
No,
something can be universal without being objective.
no, I mean, it makes it objective in the sense that all sentient beings need to be alive and they need to have liberty, and that is as a
Well, to
predicate for any
fulfill their
success.
well-being.
Not
No,
just
to
have
fulfill their interests.
yeah, so long as they for their individual interests, which are
Okay,
predicated from
and
themselves.
and why is it objectively good to fulfill the interests of sentient beings? And then you get to the circular
I
reasoning
see what you're
because
saying, but the issue,
yeah,
the issue is coming around though, is that I'm going to say is that the individual values themselves, right?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that I should value you because you value yourself. Because I understand that I don't create value in the world, and I understand that you have a value interaction, and that there is an overall better way of life for both of us if we have a combined outcome that is better.
Okay, let's say if I were to completely destroy all life in the universe and I had some kind of technology to prevent life from ever existing. So if that happened, does morality exist?
So if there was no life at all,
Yeah.
no.
Okay, so morality doesn't, so it's mind dependent.
Yeah, of course it is. It's
Yeah, so
dependent
if,
upon sentience. I mean, you have to be conscious to be sentient, man.
right. So it's not, so like, doesn't something being mind dependent mean it's not objective?
No,
No?
no. A common,
Okay.
this is like, even this is one of the reasons why I was going to use the Levinas quote in the first place, is because he even says, I'll just read in its entirety. It's not too long.
You know
The
what?
poor
Maybe you should actually define what you consider objective because I
Yeah, I
think
think we probably
that's a
should
little
have done
bit
this first as well. So, like, I mean, objective would be a fact, something that exists outside of our preferences that we cannot alter. Subjective would be a system which would be based on our feelings, thoughts, or emotions, like just overall egoism in its entirety.
okay, wait, explain objective again?
So, based on fact, empirically or logically verifiable.
Okay, well, wouldn't that mean it exists without the mind? So, like, if all
Well,
people were
well,
to die,
well,
like,
no, well,
electrons would still exist, like, protons would still
mhm.
exist.
But
So,
they can't have a subjective experience, which means that they couldn't have that there couldn't be an overall greater good for them. So what
no,
we're saying,
well, no,
like,
no, 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 no. We're just talking about the definition of objective right now. So, your
oh,
definition of objective seems to go along like my definition of objective, where it exists outside the mind. So, like protons, electrons, particles, like those are all objective, like they exist without me actually being present there. Morality doesn't work that way. Again, it requires the mind to exist, and by definition, that would be subjective. And it
no,
sounds
no,
like
you're
you're
making the mistake of saying that that morality requires the individual's mind to exist, but the morality can exist in an ethical institutional format. So take it as like almost like Minsky's virtual mind. There is a overall codified understanding of morality which is greater than any single individual. And when
okay.
we
I,
then internalize that and we can test it, and then we can increase the normative conceptual growth of that institutional system, which is what I would argue vegans are doing.
Wait, but how does that make it objective? Like, again, I'm not
It's
understanding how
culturally
something.
relative. It's culturally relative,
Well,
but it's
right. So,
objective because the greatest society would still be the one that allows for the greatest subjectivity.
again, you're just strapping on that fundamental
How am I
axiom
strapping
that it's
anything on? So long as
you
that
are.
you can have a positive experience, then so long as there can be a positive experience by more individuals, by definition, it is a better one because there are more having more. So it's like 1 + 1 + 1. You see what I mean? It's incremental
Well,
growth.
right. Well, like it's interesting you brought up math. Okay, so that's a good point. So I could say 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4. That is an objective truth, but what is one? Like, does one exist? Like, how do I know that 1 + 1 = 2?
This
Like,
is the
is that
basis
an
for
objective?
equality.
Well, no, no, listen. Well,
Sorry.
no,
Okay.
listen. I'm making a point here. So, you can't you can't describe what one is. Like, you just create one. It's basically it's sort of like a base fundamental axiom. You know, if we're comparing it to like morality, but so you can't really like explain beyond that, like what is one. Okay, well, one is 1 + 2 and 2 + 2 = 4. So we create like these base fundamental axioms like this that we can't really explain any further, but we just say, okay, well, 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, and then we can kind of infer the value of one and all these other numbers and what they add up to. So you can say 2 + 2 = 4, and that is an objective truth, but that's only assuming that you have that base fundamental axiom of what one is.
Well, it
So
depends on whether you're
it's
saying
just
that like there is one of what, isn't it? So you could have one of anything. That's the point. It's a concept which then can be applied to the universe. So we have one sentient being. We have then two sentient beings,
well,
or
right.
we have
Well,
one
math.
electron, two electrons, and so on. And
So
math
right,
is
like
physics, isn't
math. Well, math has utility. Like it's useful to have mathematical systems, and mathematical systems are used to describe things. But we can just apply this to ethics as well.
No,
Okay,
no,
well,
it
does
has objective value in itself because if we talk about gravity, let's say 1g equals like we can talk about the actual um, acceleration, the downward acceleration of gravity, and
we
we can
can
talk about the
use
universal
we right, we can use math to explain things that are objective. I agree with that, but that doesn't mean one is some kind of objective truth.
no,
It's
but we
a
can use it to
concept.
prove objective truth.
Sure,
So
sure we
yeah,
can.
yeah,
Sure we can, but I mean math itself.
yeah. I'm not
So
trying to. I'm not arguing the value of math, man.
well, right. Okay, so let's just apply this same line of reasoning to morality. Sentient beings exist. We know that.
And
So
and they
we
need
know.
life and liberty. So there's
Well,
two
no,
things.
they don't need life. They don't. Well, in order to be sentient, they do need life, but they don't necessarily need liberty to exist. So the point is, we know that sentient beings exist. We know that they prefer to live and experience well-being, and we can use morality sort of the same way we use math. Okay, well, we can say that for a sentient being, it is a moral good to experience well-being. It's a moral good to live long, but that doesn't actually mean these like base values are objective. It's just dependent on a mind. It's subjective, but we can look at this within a framework and say, okay, it's objective, that it's within the interest of a sentient being to experience well-being, but that doesn't mean well-being is an objective moral good. Just like how we could look at like a car. Okay, well, cars, you can measure like the horsepower and torque of a car. Okay, a car has like 50 Newton meters of torque. Okay, well, just because a car has 50 Newton meters of torque, that doesn't mean the math that goes behind that calculation is some kind of objective moral truth. It just means you've created these base fundamental axioms, and within that framework, it is true that that car creates 50 Newton meters of torque.
No,
Just
you
like,
see that's an objective truth, man. If the car creates that amount of force, then it creates that amount of force. That's a fact that exists without your mind.
okay, but I think you're missing the point. Like we're talking about the math itself, not whether or not the car produces
Yeah.
force.
No, but what the math is describing is all it is being used as a way to measure. It's a way of accurately determining the reality of an object so that we can understand that
It's
object better.
it's objectively
It's
true given the axioms we use that a car creates 50 Newton meters of torque. But that doesn't mean the actual math itself, like what is a Newton meter? Like how like why did we get to why is a meter this long? Why isn't it this long? So
yeah.
these things like
Well,
these math itself, it's not an objective truth, but we can have these base fundamental assumptions about math. What is number one? What is a meter? What is a centimeter? So we
all
can have
right.
these
So
base
I
fundamental.
see
Well,
what you're
listen,
getting
listen,
at.
listen, listen. We can have these base fundamental assumptions, and within that framework, we can make objective truths within that framework. This car creates 50 Newton meters of torque. We know this because 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, and we build up from there. But that doesn't mean the actual math itself is an objective truth, and that's the exact same thing I'm doing here when I try to explain to you. It is true within the framework that you're using that well-being is a value for a sentient being, but that doesn't mean well-being is a moral good objectively.
You see, my point is that take the car that is producing the 15 Newton meters of force, and was it Newton meters you used there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Regardless of the measurement that you call it, regardless of the concept you applied to it, the reality of the car is how much force it is actually applying in the universe. Would you agree? So yeah, that's what I'm saying that the math is explaining, and that is what the math is explaining in utility.
I'm not disagreeing with you that sentient beings experience well-being. Like we can agree that's a fundamental, like that's an
Yeah,
objective fact.
but that's an
But
objective fact that we
but
need to base our ethical systems off, just as we base our science
no,
off of the physical universe.
okay, you're kind of conflating things. So it is an objective fact that sentient beings experience well-being. It is not an objective fact that well-being is an objective good.
But
That's you're conflating the two.
it's an objective good because you, as a mechanism, can have a pain and pleasure response which can be measured, and your experience, which is subjective, matters to you. Right? Cool. I understand that that is somewhat arbitrary, but what is not arbitrary is your life and then your liberty only because you wish from that point. So if you think of every single desire as emanating from your need to survive, and then they hierarchize downwards. Okay, so then you have your most vital and your most trivial, right? And these are going to be difficult to measure. But if we're going to put them in any, let's say, framework, we could say that if we really wanted to boil it down, it could be on the neurological responses in your brain. But ultimately, the one thing that cannot be taken from you is your subjectivity, because that would overall always cause the greatest harm to any sentient being.
Wait, I'm not actually perfectly following along here.
Okay, so
Well, no, like again, it sounds like you're kind of using the same circular reasoning. You're saying
no,
that, well, okay, well, why don't you just explain a little further?
okay, so I could explain like what I would say ethics was based on and like how individuals like got ethics in the first place. So if you start within yourself, and that's you start with your egoistical desires, so let's call them your primary desires, then they are like your desires that come from your need for self-preservation, food, water, shelter, and then from that point you sublimate new psychological desires, which would be a desire for McDonald's, a desire for whatever kind of house, and etc. Whatever drink you want to drink. Yeah, they're more trivial than your previous desires, only because they aren't necessary for your survival. Okay, your survival predicating all of your other desires, so having the greatest overall impact upon your subjective experience. Okay, and then from that point, we can say that u equal 1 and I equal 1, and that our desires can be arbitrary and or even more psychologically arbitrary, but they all spin from that first initial value of 1. And so the most vital interest of all sentient beings has to be equal, and that is life. And that is why we'll have to say that an objective truth to all ethical systems is that all sentient beings are deserving of life. So the best system is one that provides the most subjectivity.
Okay, why are our most vital preferences important?
They're most important because they're necessary for our survival.
Okay, and why is it morally good to appeal to the preference of survival?
Because the basis of our actual preferences as a whole is that survival.
Okay, so now we're back to the circular reasoning
But
again.
that's you're
No,
gonna
like this here, like the problem you're making, like I agree with you on some level here that it is true within a certain framework that survival is a moral good. But the problem here is like we're talking more about meta-ethics, not whether something is good within a certain framework and context. So what you're mixing up here is like you're just not like getting the meta-ethical position.
it's
You're
the
just
good in
basically going
itself.
along.
That's what we're talking about. Like the existence is good in itself because it allows for any positive or negative interaction in the world. For you to have a preference,
So it's so like
it's innately good.
you're essentially admitting circular reasoning here. So it's good to appeal to the personal preferences of a sentient being because if you don't appeal to those preferences like survival, then they won't be able to exist. And existence is good because you have to, because appealing to their preferences of survival is good. Like just goes around in a circle.
it's good because if I was to have a preference at all, either good or bad, it is predicated by my existence, by my psychological existence, my subjectivity, by my sentience. And it's good, and so I couldn't have that interaction without first having that. And that's why
Right.
ethics has to encompass all sentient
I
beings.
look, I agree with you. Like I value sentience for the same reason you do. Um, I'm sentient. I have a preference to survive, and so I value my own sentience and the sentience of others because I think I'm the same as every other sentient being. But that doesn't actually mean that sentience and existence is an objective moral good. It just means I have that preference. And again,
Well,
you're kind of
it's based on fact because so long as those individuals exist and have a positive experience, the overall positive experiences in the world, regardless of how we quantify them, are higher. Do you see what I mean? You understand what I'm saying? The overall positive experience is greater in the world, and that is an objective truth. So the best ethics creates the greatest experience from sentient beings.
why is sentience good?
Well, it's not that's sentient. I've just said that sentience is. Well, you're taking us back to the point that we're going to have to say sentience is
Right.
good because I need
Sentience
my
is good.
life.
Well, right. Sentience is
So
good because it allows me to experience good. Experiencing good is good because sentience is good.
yeah, but good.
It's a circle.
Good. Yeah. That's because our experiences are underpinning. I'm not saying that subjectivity does not underpin all moral systems. Of course, it does. I'm saying that it becomes an objective truth when we combine subjective experiences because it becomes a common good. And that means that what is good for me cannot overtake what is good for everyone else. So
Okay, that sounds kind of strange. It sounds like you're
I'll give you
getting
an
away
example.
from.
The good of the murderer, for example, right, isn't able to overcome the good of the society which denounces murder.
Okay, this sounds strange because now it sounds like you're getting away from your position that morality is objective. So you're
No,
like
no,
again,
no,
you're
no.
saying, well, no, you're saying the culmination of subjective preferences makes things objectively true. So just because I have the subjective preference individually that I want to live, that doesn't make it a moral good. But
But
like, it sounds like you're saying
before you,
because every sentient being wants to live, therefore it's an objective moral good.
no,
Like,
but
that
what I'm
doesn't
saying
make
is
any
that
sense.
all of your desires are predicated by life, and that is the instance in which your value is equal to mine. That is the first instance in which my value and your value are innately equal. Because if I kill you,
Well,
I innately harm you.
sure. Yeah, but again, you have to value sentience to begin with. And when I ask you, okay, well, why does sentience matter? Because like experiencing life is good. And then I ask you, okay, well, why is it good to experience life? Because you have to experience life to experience good. But then why is it good to experience life? And then because it's good to
But
experience
the
good.
experience itself is innately positive or
We
negative.
agree. Well,
Yeah.
no, we agree that it's good to experience life, but that doesn't make it an objective good. That's a subjective good.
You see, it's strange because like when I say that it makes an objective good, like take for example Levinas, he argues the same that it makes an objective good for the same principles. That it's a I'll just read you the quote. So he says that his equality within this essential poverty consists in referring to the third party, thus the present at the encounter, whom in the midst of his destruction the other already serves. He comes to join me, but he joins me to himself for service. He commands me as a master. This command can only concern me only as much as I command myself. I am a master myself. Consequently, this command commands me to command. The thou is posited in front of a we. This is why the relation with the other discourse is not only the putting in the question of my freedom, the appeal coming from the other to call me to responsibility is not only the speech by which I first myself of the possession that encircles me by setting forth an objective and common world.
Okay,
What
you know
he's
what?
saying is that it's objective and common because it is a culmination of our experiences, and that regardless of how we come out of it, regardless of whether we hate the outcome, we could both come out of that and going, that's fucking shit. I really wish I'd have just killed that guy. It's still better that we didn't.
Okay, here's I think I figured a way to deal with this. Okay, so have you ever watched Rick and Morty?
Yeah, Rick and Morty.
Okay, so
Love Rick and
you
Morty.
know the Mises?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Mises are an alien life form. Um, I don't know how the technology works, but whatever. Basically, you
Press the
press a
button.
button on some extra dimensional, like that, some box that's attached to some extra dimensional space, and an alien pops out called a Mises. Now, Mises, their life is constant suffering, and the only way for them to die is by completing some kind of task. So if you press the button for the Mises just wants to die constantly. Like, life is suffering for them. But if you tell them mop the floor, after they mop the floor, they'll finally be able to die. So in that context, is sentience a good thing?
In that context, I would actually say, yes, sentience is a good thing. I would
Even
say
though
that
they're experiencing
even
constant
though
suffering?
they're experiencing constant suffering, their desire to die is predicated by their life.
Okay, so if somebody was suffering horribly in a hospital bed, like some, 70, 80-year-old dude suffering from some kind of horrible, horrible disease, some form of cancer, received absolutely no pleasure. He was completely debilitated, constant pain, just kept asking to die. Please, please, please let me die. There's absolutely no help whatsoever in curing his illness. We know he's going to die within a few months, but, we could keep him alive and have him suffer horribly. Or we could just, give him assisted suicide. So you're saying you're against assisted suicide because in order to experience the good of dying, like, you have to be
Yeah,
sentient?
no. I know it's fucked up, isn't it? Yeah, I know.
What?
No, I know, but this is the basis of ethics, and I would like to think that in most in an objective world, then what we would say is that from that point in which we can experience life, and that's where we all have our desires emanate, then our experiences then denote the value that we then give ourselves. So yeah, our subjectivity does change the value of our lives, but it's always predicated by our desire for
Okay,
life,
okay, but
by our need to life.
Given your like answer for the Rick and Morty thing, the Mises, so are you actually against assisted suicide?
Um, I suppose it like I would say that I would so just to thing it down. There is absolutely no chance that this person could
Yeah,
experience any good, and it's an
yeah,
infinite negative
exactly.
experience.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. I'm gonna have to give us 2 seconds.
Because it's the same with the Mises, so it's kind of strange. Like the answer should be obvious. Like they're in constant suffering and they just want to die. So I don't know why you'd say it's a moral good for them to live when their life is just constant suffering. So if you're going to say it's a moral good for them to live even though their life is constant suffering,
No,
then
no,
you
no. Actually,
should.
I think that no, no. Sorry, I fucked up my reasoning there. What I meant to say, it's a moral good for them to express their subjectivity, and their subjectivity is to die.
So it's a moral good for them to live and then die,
Yeah.
even though their life is constant suffering and they hate living.
So when they are created, so I wouldn't like once they are created, I would say it's immoral to create them because you know they're going to suffer.
Sure.
But once they are created, then for them to express their subjectivity and to die would be a moral good for them. And then the culmination of all Mises trying to kill themselves and are being allowed to kill themselves, let's say we had an infinite world of Mises constantly being restrained, the more Mises that were unrestrained and allowed to die, the better. And that is an objective truth because there is a
Okay.
greater overall utility.
Well, if it's a moral good for them to exist and then die, then wouldn't it also be a moral good to actually bring them into existence?
No, because the overall suffering would increase before it is then turned back to zero. So you would be taking it from a place which would be 0 to -1 to 0 again, rather than +1 to 0. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a good in the sense that it's less bad. Just as if I
Okay.
avoid being executed, it would be a good like avoid being executed by getting life imprisonment. It would probably be better for me. I would choose that rather than
Okay, so let me just be clear. So with the Mises, you're saying it's a neutral to have them live and die, like a net neutral?
I would say it's a net neutral once they're dead because their life is infinite suffering.
So well, how does that work? If their life is infinite suffering and then they die, wouldn't that be a net negative?
Well, no, because once they're created, because their life predicates their values and their subjectivity, and that's good for them. What is good for them is their self-expression, their expression of their own will, which
Okay,
can be self-destruction.
okay, so is it better for them to exist at all, like for a limited period of time, or is it better for them to not exist at all?
It would probably not exist at all. Yeah.
Okay, so let's say Mises were the only species that exists in the entire universe, nothing else exists. And we created a machine where it would press the box occasionally, and the machine would give the Mises an instruction. And like we all died off. We just created this machine to bring the Mises into existence. So you're saying you'd want all life on in all of existence to die off if we were
Well,
to.
if they were all infinitely suffering and in a state of pretty much pure hell, yeah, yeah, I would.
Okay, so then you don't even value sentience necessarily.
No, I value the subjectivity, the will that sentience gives you. It's not necessarily the sentience itself, it's that ability to experience positive or negative. If your experience is so negative that you wish to die and that will overall relieve you of such pain, then the expression of your will is the greatest good.
Okay, so this seems to contradict what you said before, because in order to experience any kind of in order to have any kind of experience, you need sentience. So we should value sentience first and foremost. Is that not what you said before?
Well, we value sentience in the sense that it gives you your will. So we're valuing your will, your subjectivity. That is why I said you need liberty as the expression of your will.
Okay.
But life and liberty are infinite, are worth each other. There's no sense in being imprisoned and alive if you are, let's say, you are put in a prison which would torture for all of eternity. That is worse than not being alive at all, because you would have a greater negative interaction with the world. And in that case, on an objective level, we would say that the common world, the common good, would be best if everyone did not have an infinitely negative experience and had a more positive experience. And it would, the greatest good would be the greatest expression of the individual's subjectivity, which is the Hegelian moral stance.
Okay, so if we did create a universe where only Mises could exist, you'd be against that? So
Yeah.
you'd prefer absolutely no existence whatsoever, no sentience, just everything's dead, over Mises existing.
So rather, yeah. So if we had to choose between a world of, let's say, infinite sentience and suffering and no sentience, then yeah,
Okay.
because their will is self destruction. So we would be pretty much adhering to their greatest good anyway. Because the culmination of their wills would be destruction. So if we don't create them, then the culmination would be exactly the same. We would end up at the same telos, the same end.
Okay, I see. And why do you so you value the absolute destruction of all life on Earth over Mises existing?
Oh no. Sorry. What? So you would say destroy all life
Oh,
on
sorry,
Earth.
in the universe, in the universe.
Oh, so you destroy all life in the universe.
If you only had the two choices between destroying all life in the universe and having only Mises exist, you'd choose destroying all life in the universe because the Mises don't want to live. It's their like you want to appeal to their
Well,
preference.
you've destroyed all life either way, haven't you? That's the whole point. You've
Well,
destroyed.
no,
You've
Mises.
replaced them. You've replaced them all with Mises.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you've destroyed. So you've destroyed it either way. I mean, you've destroyed all
No.
positive
Well,
experience.
okay, so you've destroyed all positive experience, yeah. But you'd prefer to have a world where you completely destroy all life, as opposed to having Mises exist only.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is you want to appeal to their own preference of not existing.
Yes.
Okay, so why is
And
it a
then
moral good? So okay,
it's a moral
so
good because the culmination of each individual Mises is self-destruction.
but that's their own personal preference.
Yeah, but it's
So
based on
it's not objective.
but it's based on their sentience in which they were all equal.
Yeah, but that's
So
not objective.
but what we're saying is that each and every individual Mises wants to die the same.
Okay. Okay, well, let's
So
say,
let's say we're hierarchized the Mises and put them into, there is a Mises that will suffer the most, and a Mises that will suffer slightly less, and a Mises that will suffer slightly less than that. You see where I'm going? But they all suffering horribly and need to die. Then we should kill them in the order in which they are suffering the most.
okay, right, but you're just making an appeal to their own subjective preference.
No,
This
but
isn't objective.
the objectivity is the greatest, is the culmination of their experiences. It is
Well,
the
that's not
culmination of
objective. Well,
that is objective,
no,
man, because
that's
that's a
not
fact.
objective.
That
No,
is a fact.
something can be universal but not
It's a
objective.
fact.
It's
It's a
exactly the
fact.
same thing.
It's a
Well,
fact.
something
It's
something can't.
can something be a fact and
Well,
not
can
and
you
subject?
explain to me how it is a fact?
It's
Because
a fact that they will all. I'm saying it that this is true, that they are suffering like this.
sure, okay, that's an
Yeah.
objective fact. They're suffering.
Okay.
Okay.
They're suffering, and they're suffering in a hierarchized fashion.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's
Okay.
just say they're all
So
suffering
the
equally. They're all the
the,
same, like clone species.
suffering. No. I'm saying that we'll hierarchize them in to prove a point, to say that there can be ethical differences. And like, for example, the good of, let's say, me murdering you is not the same as the good of your life. You see what I'm saying? Like, because you value.
Okay, well, this is just adding some like weird level of complexity that I don't see as necessary. Let's just say they're all the same clone species and they all suffer equally.
No, can I explain why I think it is necessary? Because once they all suffer equally, then we can say, yeah, they all want to die, and so the ultimate good for them is death. Yeah, but I'm saying that if we were to be only able to kill one at a time, let's say, right?
Why does that matter? Like, what
Not
if you could
because
just...
no. Let's say we could just kill one at a time.
Okay.
Okay, then we should start with the one that is suffering the most and work our way down because objectively, the suffering in the universe would diminish. And that is a fact.
Well, that is a fact, but again,
And that
you're
is
gonna
what
use the
ethics
same...
is
No, no,
based on.
no, no. I agree with that. There are some that are suffering worse. Like, we could agree that that's an objective fact. Why is it an objective moral good to kill off the ones that are suffering the most first?
So you're
And
saying
again,
why do I value suffering? And then I will say because
yeah, personal
the com
preference, which is
well no
subjective.
no no because then you're saying that it's why do I adhere to a moral system? And that would be if I'm adhering to a moral system, it doesn't change the value interaction these beings are having. So
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. But
so if we
that's the
understand
problem.
ethics, if we understand ethics as being the greatest good or bad, good and bad being democratically agreed upon, then we have to, and we all agree that all we all express
That doesn't prove it's
our
objective, though.
no, but what we're saying is that it does prove it's objective because what we're saying is that there is suffering is going down.
No, we agree on
Objective,
that. We
yeah,
agree on that. Suffering
that's
is
a fact.
going down objectively, but it's on the value. Like, why do you value that?
Why
Why is it
should
a
you
moral
value
good?
another being?
Why is it an objective moral good to reduce suffering in that way?
So it's essentially why should I treat you as an equal to myself?
Well, no, let's keep within this Mises context. So you can only kill one Mises at a time, and you're going after the ones that suffer the most first.
Yeah,
So it is an objective truth that you are reducing the amount of suffering in the universe. That is an objective truth. We don't disagree there. But why is it an objective moral good that you are reducing the suffering in the universe in the most efficient way possible?
because the individual themselves experiences a negative, and then the objective of that is that the overall negative experience drops. So it's that
We
it's a
agree.
subjective
We
experience.
agree on that, but you're not actually
Yeah,
answering my question. We agree that you are objectively reducing the amount of suffering in the universe. Why is it an objective moral good to reduce the suffering in the universe? So we already agree that you are reducing, we already agree, just to clarify, that you are reducing the amount of suffering in the universe. I'm
yeah,
asking you, why is it an objective moral good?
it's an objective moral good because the value that every individual has emanates from their subjectivity.
Okay, so you admit it's subjective.
It's
You admit
not.
it's
No,
subjective.
no, no, no. I've admitted that they have a subjective experience, but the objectivity of an ethical system is the culmination of that subjectivity.
This is going around in a circle again, dude. You can't like, okay, so I'll explain what you're doing. So you're saying that it is objectively true that you're reducing the amount of suffering in the
Yes.
universe. And that's the part we agree on. So then
Yeah.
I ask you, why is it an objective moral good to reduce the suffering in the universe? And then your answer is just, it's reducing the amount of suffering in the universe.
Well, my answer is that to reduce suffering is good because the reduction of suffering is good to all sentient beings, regardless, so long as.
So then it is subjective. So then you admit it's subjective.
No, that's not. That's subjective.
No,
That's the
that's
culmination of
really,
subjectivity is an objective principle because you even said
that's
yourself it is a fact that when it goes down, that's the point. So the best
no, you're
system.
appealing to personal preference.
How
So
am I
which is
appealing to
subjective.
preference? How am I
That
appealing
is
to
an
preference?
appeal to personal preference.
It's
So
not my preference.
no,
It's
it's
the
not your
preferences
preference,
of
but it
everyone.
is an appeal. It is an appeal. Okay, well,
Once it leaves
again,
myself, it's an objective point.
something can be universal without being objective. So I'll explain why you're appealing to personal preference, which is an appeal to subjectivity. So when I ask you, why is it a moral good to reduce the amount of suffering in the universe? And then you say, well, because the culmination of everyone's subjective preferences results in the culmination in appealing to everyone's objective preferences results in a reduction in suffering, and which is what everyone wants. Okay, well, everyone wants that, but that doesn't make it objective. So you're appealing to everyone's subjective personal preferences, and you're adding in this other like layer where you're claiming it's universal. Well, again, we've already established that something being universal doesn't make it objective. So you are appealing to subjectivity. So
No, because the difference
think at this
between
point,
the difference between the system that I'm promoting and a system that will be a subjective system is that a subjective system is purely based on preference, my preference, and then when I wish you to adhere to it, there is no evidence, there is no evidentiary claims, otherwise it becomes objective.
okay, you're gonna have to explain that again.
So, for example, is what is better the society in which people feel overall better or feel overall worse?
Well, explain to me why it's subjective to feel overall better.
Why it's no. What I'm asking you is to tell me what society is better innately, the one that feels better or the one that feels worse.
You mean objectively?
Is that true? Let's say I wish to create a society that can create two societies. Okay.
Right. Okay.
One causes infinite suffering, one causes infinite pleasure.
Okay.
Is
Heaven
one
help, sure.
Yeah. Is one better than the other? Objectively.
Okay, well, you can't prove that objectively because, again, this is going to come down to subjective preference. This is going to come down to subjective preference. And sentient beings have the subjective preference to experience well-being. Now, it could be universal. Literally zero beings ever in existence in complete infinity could all choose to live in heaven. But that doesn't mean it's objective. That just means it's universally subjective. Okay, so again, you're just appealing to personal subjective preference, and you're just basically admitting
I'm appealing to the fact that it is a better experience in general, and that is what makes it better.
It's subjectively seen as a better experience by sentient beings.
It's not subjective. No, because no matter who perceives it, it remains better. That's the point. Regardless of who's looking at the society from the outside, it will always be better.
No, not necessarily. Let's say you created a sentient machine that had no ability to experience pain or suffering. Would it be? How would you explain to?
How is it? It's not sentient if it can't experience pain or pleasure.
I think it could. Pain and pleasure aren't the only sensations that a sentient being can experience. Like sentience, all sentience is the ability to
is pain or pleasure, isn't it? Let's be honest.
All sentience is the ability to experience the world subjectively. So you can be sentient and not experience any pain or pleasure. It is possible. Now, in a biological context, that might be impossible. You could actually argue that, because of evolution and pleasure pathways. But if we were to create like a sentient machine, I'd say it is possible to create a sentient machine that can't experience pain or suffering.
Okay, but then it has no subjectivity because it has no interests.
Well,
it needs to have, for it to have an interest, it needs to have a value interaction with the world.
Well, just because it doesn't experience pain or pleasure, that doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily have any kind of preferences.
But what is the good of that being? It has no good or bad, yeah? So if you were to kill that being, I wouldn't have a problem. Because it has no will.
Necessarily. Well, look, the point is you're basically trying to claim that something is objectively true because it's universal, which just
I think the strange point I'm getting. I think the strange point that I'm finding with you here is that when I say that objectively the pain and pleasure responses of the universe go up or down, and that is a fact, you agree?
Okay, yeah. Sure, yeah, we agree.
And those have values to the individuals innately to themselves. So the greatest good is, regardless of their preferences to the ethical system, so regardless of what ethical system they want to live in, the greatest ethical system will always be the one that allows them to express their subjectivity the most.
Okay, and why is that good?
But it's good because it's the culmination of every good that they experience, and it's good for them because they have determined subjectively that it is good for them. So what we've taken is a
So you admit it's
subjective position.
subjective.
No, we've taken a subjective position and turned it, we've culminated it into a common objective one. What you otherwise I could dismiss that, say actually, in my opinion, the greatest society is not the one that has the greatest overall happiness, experience pleasure, minimizing pain, but instead is the one that experiences the most pain because I think so. But that is objectively untrue because each and every single individual within the society that feels pleasure and the society that feels pain would be better off swapped.
Again, you're just appealing to subjectivity here. Like again, like
Yeah,
we can. You're kind of adding layers of complexity that are unnecessary. Explain to me
I don't think.
why. No, no, no. Explain to me why pleasure is good, and why
That's
is suffering bad.
it's an
The
experience in
only
itself,
well,
isn't it?
listen. The only answer you have to me is personal preference,
Yeah,
which
but
is subjective.
yeah. So we always will start with the subjective individual. That's why Levinas says that he
So it's
starts
not
within
objective.
himself. No, okay, right. So this philosopher thinks like, so most philosophers who use the word objective would call this an objective system. I'm yet to see a philosopher who would call this a subjective system, which could be dismissed on a whim just because um like in what way could you dismiss this? What way could you say that any other society could be better than a society which values the subjectivity of all of its members?
Like
Like,
again, you're
give me
going
an
to
ethical system. Give me an ethical system which is better than the society which creates the overall greatest positive for its members.
how is pleasure positive?
Because but it's positive to the being itself.
So it's
It,
subjective. Like
it
you're
comes
agreeing
no,
with me.
no, man. It comes from a subjective stance, man. I think we do agree for the most part, right? Right. I think that's probably
So
why we're vegan in the first place, right? Like,
so I'll agree. Like this is where we agree. So we agree within a certain framework that there are objective moral truths. So if you value something like well-being, then you're going to have to give animals a right to live and you're going to have to treat them well because they can experience well-being. Where we disagree is whether it's almost as if you don't believe that these axioms exist, and it's as if like moral good just doesn't have
no, you see, what
sorry,
I'm
you can
saying is that
create. It's
these
like you can.
axioms are the result, that these ethical systems are the result and of conceptual growth from an investigation into the nature of being, an ontological investigation. We understand beings as having pain and pleasure responses, yeah? So once we understand that, the best ethical system is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain for all sentient beings.
Right, and you only get there when you just bootstrap on fundamental axioms like
No, you don't.
pain
You
is
don't.
bad, pleasure is good.
The
Yeah,
only reason,
that's
no, because pain is innately bad and pleasure
why
is
is it
innately
innately
good.
bad? Okay, well,
Because
why is
it's because it is by definition to that being.
right? So it's subjective.
Unless you can point out a sentient being that cannot feel pain or pleasure and would still be considered sentient. I mean, when you say the robot that says is sentient, what you've really said is it's conscious. You've not said it's sentient.
Sentience and consciousness is the exact same thing.
No, it's not. You can be
It is the
no.
exact same thing.
No, because
Okay,
you could
well,
have.
explain the difference between consciousness and sentience.
Okay, so you could have a conscious computer which runs through data. It has
Okay,
a
that's
mind, but
you're
no
explaining
value.
you're explaining intelligence. Intelligence is
Yeah.
different than consciousness. So a calculator is intelligent. Intelligence is just the ability to respond to stimulus. So you can actually empirically demonstrate intelligence. Sentience and consciousness, it's the exact same thing, but it's something that you have
No,
to
because there's a self-awareness added to sentience.
no, no, you don't have to be self-aware to be sentient. It's harder to prove that something is sentient. Actually, like we can't even prove that we're sentient. We're basically just assuming it. and we just assume that other beings are sentient through inductive reasoning, or
Well,
sorry,
you think
deductive
I
reasoning.
was going to say it's definitely not.
Yeah, deductive reasoning. Sorry.
Yeah. I think you see. I understand. Like when I say self-aware, I mean has a self. So when you're conscious, you do not necessarily need to have any interests at
Okay.
all. But
Okay.
when you have a self that is interacting with the world, that desires good or wishes to avoid bad, that is where sentience comes in.
I
I mean,
don't think
don't get
that's
me
the
wrong.
actual definition of
Yeah,
sentience.
but have
Like
you ever?
you can create that definition, but I don't think that's the definition of
No,
sentience.
that's
Also, you should know that like there's drugs like psilocybin mushrooms, DMT. They actually deactivate the part of your brain that's responsible for self-awareness.
Oh no,
You
no, I agreed.
and I've
When
experienced this
so
shit myself, or I've taken mushrooms and I literally forgot that I exist.
no, no, I
So
understand what you're saying, but
that
like
doesn't
the
mean I
thing is,
ceased being sentient.
no, it ceased. It no, what did cease was probably perhaps like in some respects, it's like you can be unconscious and sentient because sentience is the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively.
Yeah,
Now,
well,
yeah,
okay, well, I think you're just using a different definition of conscious because you could say someone's unconscious because they're asleep, but
oh,
consciousness in the broad
oh,
sense that, okay, you're a living being that can experience, the world subjectively.
no, yeah, but you said that I was using these definitions wrong. Well, conscious is aware of and responding to one's surroundings, so there is no feeling there. That is the
What do you,
difference.
well, wait, what do you mean?
So, conscious, aware of, and responding to one's surroundings, and
Okay.
sentience is the capacity to feel, perceive, experience subjectively.
Okay, well, you can feel and experience things without feeling pain or pleasure. Like I can feel my desk, it's kind of got a rough texture. It's not painful or pleasurable.
Yeah, but it would be morally neutral if all of these experiences were the same. Yeah. So if they all,
What?
so
So
if you had no preference one way or the other.
yeah, so if I had no ability to experience pain or pleasure, it would be morally, like, it wouldn't even be a moral question to go into heaven or hell. Like, if you can't
Yeah.
experience pain or pleasure either way, it would be like a morally neutral situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you couldn't
Right.
experience pain or pleasure, it wouldn't matter where you were. Yeah.
Right, but you agree you can be sentient without feeling pain or pleasure.
I can. Well, I don't. I'm actually unsure because I think what we've done there is we've created a being which can feel some form of sensation, but
Okay.
at least, but it's not just. But the thing is, are they feeling or are they just aware of? That's what I'm asking you here. Is that not just an awareness?
Well, no. Like,
But
again,
what's
you can have like a tactile sensation without it being painful or pleasurable, right?
perhaps you can, but is that not? Will you not innately? Will it not change you in some way or another?
Well, I'm sure it will change the way you think and interact with the world, but that doesn't mean you're not sentient.
I think the thing is that so long as they, one second, I'm just going to quickly double check this definition. I hate playing like I hate having to go on like definitions and that, but sometimes it's the quality of being right. So the quality of being based or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. So that's a subjective experience in which sentience is opposed to. So it says
Okay.
sentience, the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively. The subjectivity, the quality of being based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. So subjectivity, you require subjectivity to be sentient.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, so you don't think it's possible to have maybe some kind of preference without feeling pain or pleasure?
Um.
Like
No,
I
I think
prefer the
I think,
color green as opposed to the color purple?
but then I say that it's doing it's bringing you pleasure or minimizing your pain. Because if you prefer the
I
color purple because
suppose
you hate purple, I mean hate green, then yeah, or vice versa.
I suppose like I guess you
Yeah.
could say that like that would be suffering. Like, okay, I'd prefer green as opposed to my red being, or sorry, I'd oppose my room being painted green. I'd prefer my room being painted green than being painted red. Like, I guess you could say, okay, if my room's painted red, that would cause some amount of suffering. I see what you're saying there, but like, I'm still not like, I'm still not getting your explanation for why pleasure is objectively good and pain is objectively bad.
Because the
Um,
individual's experience is either good or bad to themselves, and then the
right.
culmination
So
of
it's
all individuals is objectively verifiable,
okay. Okay.
and
So
then that's a
here's
fact.
the
So
okay. So here's where I think your line of reasoning falls apart. So you agree that it's subjective to the experience of the being, whether or not like pain is good and pleasure is good. And then you're claiming that because these beings all experience pain and pleasure, and because they can all agree that pain is bad and pleasure is good, that means pain is objectively bad and pleasure is objectively good. But again, you're failing on two parts here. So first, you're appealing to personal preference, which is subjective. And then secondly, you're claiming because this is universal, therefore it's objective, which just isn't true.
no, the reason it's objective is because the system in which you create, the system in which I create, and the system which anyone creates, even the institutional system of our society, will always be better objectively by what you said was a fact, which was the minimization of suffering and the maximization of pleasure. And that the best system will always be, from every single standpoint, the greatest expression of subjectivity. And that's an objective fact.
Okay, so objectivity comes from the culmination of subjective experiences.
Yeah,
Okay, so then why does the culmination of subjective experiences create something that's objective?
it's objective because because when we apply any ethical system to it, it will always be judged against what is the reality of the world, which is the pain and pleasure responses of sentient beings.
Okay, I think we're just gonna fundamentally disagree here because I see this as an appeal to something being universal. I just
But how is
disagree
it
just
universal? Because I see this as a fact. I don't see how you could say this is anything. How you could say this is subjective. I don't understand.
okay, so like I think we can agree that sentience exists and sentient beings can experience suffering and pain, like pain and suffering and pleasure as well. Um, Now, they just because they all subjectively don't like pain and they subjectively like pleasure, I don't see how that being universally like universal makes it objectively true that pain is bad and pleasure is good.
Well, pain is
Like
bad and
you're
pleasure is good
basically
because, but I mean,
because
well,
the issue
like,
here is you just end up with circular line of reasoning. Okay, well, why is pleasure good? Because it's good for the sentient beings. Okay, well, why is it good for sentient beings to experience pleasure? Because sentient beings like pleasure. Okay, well, why is it good for them to experience pleasure? Because they like pleasure. So you just go around in a circular reason, like the circular line of
no.
reasoning.
What we're going around in is the empirical experience of beings within the world, and that comes from our physical our our biology.
I agree that sentient beings don't want to suffer and they
Hmm.
want to feel pleasure, but
Yes,
that doesn't
always.
mean it's an objective moral good to not cause sentient beings not cause sentient beings suffering and to try to give them pleasure.
Well, yes, it does because the overall greatest society is the one that suffers the least, and then the overall greatest ethics and the ethical principles which found that will be founded upon that reality.
Right. Well, you have to actually just bootstrap on certain values. So you just have to
No doubt.
automatically
We will
assume.
create concepts which will
Right.
be, but they
So
will
it's
be
subjective.
measured, but they'll be measured against an objective standard, and that objective standard will increase the overall goodness of our ethics, and that's why we get moral
No,
progression. And
no,
it's the same thing with science. For example, maths being the expression of physics. Yeah, it tries to understand and accurately measure the universe in a way that is understandable by humans. That is exactly what morality is doing in a way that will eventually create the best experience. The ethical system is always better than the one previous to it if it creates a greater experience for all individuals.
we'll define a greater experience.
A more pleasurable or less painful.
Okay, and why is that morally good?
Because it's good to the individual themselves, and we all equally have the same value innately. And we all have the same value innately because it's based upon our own egos. So long as I don't think of myself as the giver of value in the world, then an ethical system is the culmination, the democratic value in the world. And that's what
Right.
ethics is.
Okay.
It's a democratic
So
value. And it's
right.
democratic.
So like, I still don't understand how the culmination of these subjective preferences results in an objective truth.
Because
Like, just because something's universal, how does that make it objective?
Okay, right. Let's give me a scientific objective truth.
Okay, like gravity exists.
Okay, right. So gravity exists, but but how we understand gravity keeps getting better, doesn't it? Because we're able to more accurately measure using better instruments. We're able to use maths in more complicated and more dynamic ways that eventually allow for greater conceptual growths. So we start off from a position, let's say 2,000 years ago, and then we'll finally end up in like quantum physics and so on through the progression of conceptual growths. These have been created by individuals and tested against reality, right? I
Okay.
agree, but they're objective truths, right? And then when we find something that has more truth, then it has more objective truth within it. Yeah, we will never reach a perfect level of objectivity, but that's what Karl Popper says about science and everything. Everything's never going to be perfectly objective, but we are heading towards a perfection as we progress.
Okay, I don't think you're actually understanding the math analogy I made. So again, there are like objective truths like, okay, gravity exists, and we use math to determine, like, or to explain gravity. So, we can say suffering and pleasure exists, and we can use moral systems to describe what is painful, what is pleasurable, what would be an overall
No, we
benefit
use
for
we use moral
society.
systems to describe how to maximize or minimize
Right.
pain and pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that doesn't actually mean that numbers exist. Like, that doesn't mean the math itself we're using is an objective truth. It means there are objective truths, and we use something else to
The
explain what's going on.
the
So it's
objective
kind
truth
of the
is
same thing.
reality.
Well, listen, it's kind of the same thing with morals. So we can say that it is objectively true that beings experience pain and pleasure. That doesn't mean it is an objective truth that it's morally good or bad.
No, but
Now,
take
in
gravity
order,
itself. Would we say it was objectively true that the actually let's take the speed of light. Would we objectively say that this would we say it's an objective truth that the speed of light is a constant? That is, well, I can't
sure.
remember off the top of my head. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. But we might be able to accurately measure that as we grow conceptually. We might get greater understanding of of the physics of the universe, which will eventually illuminate an even greater scientific position, right? That is conceptual growth, but that is objectively true based upon our comparison against the universe. Now, the ability to actualize and measure the universe, yeah, it's flawed because humans are flawed, but it is getting better, and it's getting better against an objective truth, namely the universe in physics, the universe itself in physics, and in morality and ethics against the culmination of a subjective moral, positive or negative experience.
Again, the only way you're actually determining whether or not these are positive or negative experiences is you're starting off with a fundamental base axiom that's basically just an assumption or just a preference of
What axiom
yours.
am I starting with?
Well, no, you're starting off with a preference of yours, well-being and existence, and from
What
that
is
preference,
what?
you're
How am I
just
starting with the
expanding out from
preference?
there. Sorry?
I'm starting from the other. So I'm starting from your preferences and everyone else's, including mine.
Well, that doesn't matter. You're just creating a base fundamental axiom, and then from there, you you just determine within that framework whether something's moral or not. So you're like, this isn't an objective truth. You're just saying it's an objective truth because that's basically everyone's preference to value this one axiom from which we derive moral values and ethical
No, but
systems
the
from.
whole point is there cannot be a sentient being which does not value the content of its own will.
You're saying there isn't, well, again, that's just an appeal to you, like something being universal. Just because something's universal doesn't make it objective. So,
No, it's not. It's the thing is, what is objective about it is the fact that we cannot. The better one, the better, the better. I wouldn't call it a subjective system. The better conceptualized system, right? So, like, take for example the atomic model. The better atomic model is the one that most accurately depicts the atom.
okay.
The better moral system is the one that most accurately represents the greatest subjectivity of all sentient beings.
Okay, but again, you're just creating a base axiom there that like you're valuing the preferences or the culmination of preferences of sentient beings.
No, I'm saying that we
Um,
all value our own, and from that point, that is all we need. So as long as we give ourselves value,
right.
yeah, then the culmination of our values outside of my personal preferences. So I can't change the overall right or wrongness of this system by changing my opinion, my feelings, or my thoughts on it. The greatest system will always be the one that creates the greatest overall pain, pleasure, and minimizing pain response.
Well, it's only because you value pleasure and you want to avoid pain.
So if I didn't value another being's pain, would
Right.
that mean that my ethical system would be objectively the same value as a system that did take that into account?
Okay, you're asking me whether or not.
Objectively.
Sorry.
So purely
Sorry.
objectively.
Explain that question again. Like,
So if so if okay, so a society of murderers with particular preferences versus a society of humanitarians, okay, there is more subjective expression of wills in the society of humanitarians. Okay, there is a greater pleasure and a lesser pain than in the society of murderers. I
okay.
will say that it is objectively better because democratically, the combined view of all of those sentient beings creates a value greater than any individual being within that society.
Okay, so you're just saying the culmination of pleasure is greater than in one society than the culmination of pleasure in another?
And that is a standard in which we progress towards what is a universal truth, which is pain is bad and pleasure is good, and that's just because we're subjective. That is subjectivity
Okay.
rounded up.
Why is it objective that a greater amount of pleasure is better?
It's objective because it cannot be influenced, but it's objective because we will all democratically agree it is better because we all equal the same. We all have the same value structures in the sense that we all are sentient. We can all have a pain and pleasure response. So the more pain in the world, which would be difficult to measure, I agree, but let's say we could measure it accurately, like perfectly, then we would say that the perfect society would have the lowest pain and highest pleasure because it would be better for each and every single individual will, or at least the greatest amount of will. It would be the greatest good for the greatest number.
Okay. Again, you're running into the same problems. So it's circular reasoning and the universal thing. So when I ask you, why is it an objective
It's,
moral good to
I
create
don't think
the
you
most amount of
understand
pleasure?
subjectivity
No, no,
then,
no, no.
Matthew.
Listen. So when I tell you, why does it create the most amount of, why is it objectively moral good to create the most amount of pleasure? You say because sentient beings want that. And then I ask you, okay, well, why is it good to give them what they want? Well, because they want that. So like basically you're just agreeing here that it's subjective, even though you're using like a circular reasoning. And again, this
I
is
think I can
universal.
express this in a better way. If okay, so I think ask yourself described you both as polyaxiom-aticists. Would you say that was right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're
Okay. So
neither
describe that.
deontology. So deontology, like it's basically a rule-based system. Like you can't kill, you can't
Mhm.
steal, things like that. But you can run into situations where that wouldn't be ideal. Like, okay, so what if somebody was trying to murder me? Like, okay, well, is it okay to kill myself in self-defense? I'd say so. What about stealing? What if like I had to steal to survive? Like, is
Oh
that
yeah,
morally wrong? Like,
deontology is inherently flawed, but that's
yeah,
not all objective systems are deontological.
and then there's consequentialism where, okay, well, we can look at the overall consequence of a situation and based on that, see whether or not what happened is moral. So with consequentialism, you could argue that, okay, well, rape is bad because, you know, when somebody rapes somebody, the amount of pain and suffering they experience from being raped is far greater than the pleasure the rapist experiences.
Yeah.
But with consequentialism, you could have a situation where the rapist drugs a woman, rapes her, and then she never knows a rape ever fucking happened, and then he experienced pleasure. So you could say the overall consequence of that situation was net good.
No, because
So
then
there,
what you're saying is, can you be harmed without being conscious there?
well, no,
Right?
they're not
Yeah, you
harmed. So
can.
no,
No, no.
like
So, like, okay, so if let's say I've been raped an infinite number of times in my sleep last night and I'm completely unaware of it, have I been harmed?
no. Well,
Yeah.
not unless
Oh
you
no,
have
I
any kind of
haven't.
physical or emotional pain.
No, no, I haven't. Unfortunately, I mean, don't get me wrong. I would say that that was actually, I would say that in a fucked up way, yeah, that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except you could never reach that position without actually harming someone. For example, to drug someone, you would have to violate their liberty, which they value. You would have to
Yeah,
violate the
but they'd
content
never
of
know
their
about it.
will. Yeah, okay, yeah, but
Yeah,
for
but
them
and
to
then
be
if
in
you're
that
talking about
situation,
liberty, then you're talking about
yeah. But then, okay,
deontology.
no, no, no. So you can say that someone values a certain, um, let's say, something within themselves, which they, if they found out, would be harmed. Now, I agree, unless they found out they won't be harmed. But what we're saying then is that there could be a situation in which someone exploits an individual, and then no suffering is occurred. Now, I would say that that is actually not immoral, but I would say it's impossible.
No, like okay, well, say if somebody was in a coma, they're just in a hospital bed, and you just had sex with them. Like, is that harming them? Like, unless you're actually causing them physical pain, how is that harming them?
I would say it
And
was.
they'd never find out about it. So how is that harming them?
So you're saying that if there was an absolute, so there's a position, because I think it would be the, for me, it would be the potential that they could find out, and then the greater overall potential of them finding out would be what would harm them.
Okay, well, what if they never did?
Well, if what if they never did, then didn't harm them, and that it was immoral in the sense that the intention of the individual could not have known that they would not have found out in the future, and as
Yeah.
well that while they're doing that, they know that the individual themselves, who is unconscious, does value something, and that when they trespass on their value structure, that if the individual was made aware of it, they would be harmed. So that is immoral. And that's how you
Okay.
can lead to, that's how duties and deontological structures can come from a consequentialist basis.
Okay. Well, this is kind of up going off topic, but like I think we should kind of wrap up the debate here
Yeah.
because we're kind of arguing in a circle. I'd say the fundamental problem with your position here is you're talking about like normative ethics, not meta ethics, when you're talking about like objective moral standards or objective morality. Like all of your arguments were about normative ethics, where you were accepting like fundamental base axioms like valuing well-being and sentience, but you didn't want to admit that you're using fundamental base axioms, and instead you were either using circular reasoning. It's an objective good to cause well-being because sentient beings want well-being. And then when I asked you, okay, well, why is an objective good to give sentient beings well-being? Well, because they want well-being. And you were also just claiming that, well, because universally sentient beings want to experience well-being, therefore it's objective. That's just logically.
You see, I don't think you understand, and I will say, wrapping this up, I'll
Sure.
say that I don't think that you understand that it's not subjective, but it's objective. And the reason for that is because if we were to create two subjective based systems, there would always be a preference, there would always be equal in value in the world. They would never actually have a greater overall importance. We could adhere to them or not, but that's just a choice. There would never be a moral obligation to adhere to them because at best it can be an aesthetic in which we say that it's a fan club or a cult or a religion, but it could never ever be good in and of itself to adhere to any ethical system. Now, what I'm saying is that it's good in and of itself because objectively, the pain and pleasure responses of all culminated sentient beings would go up or down. And that would create what would be an objective value structure.
Okay, that doesn't make any sense either. So you're saying if we recognize that moral values are subjective, that would mean people wouldn't follow them. That's not
No,
true.
that's not what I said. I said
Like,
that if we recognize that they're subjective, that your opinion is as valid as mine, and all of our opinions are equally as
not
valid.
necessarily. Not
No,
necessarily.
yeah,
Well, no,
yeah.
no,
So long
that's
as they're
not.
logically consistent.
No, no, not at all. So you can have a completely morally consistent, sorry, a completely logically consistent moral position that no one would want to abide by because it doesn't have the outcome that is desired. So again, you admitted yourself that ethical systems have a utility, and sentient
Wait,
beings have personal preferences. So if a moral system doesn't meet your personal preferences, then you're not going to want to follow it. Like we could
why?
all
Okay,
no,
okay.
we
So
can have
why?
like Hannibal Lecter's moral system where, okay, well, we can kill and eat each other. Okay, nobody wants to follow that because it doesn't maximize well-being and longevity. So they're going to follow a moral system that values well-being and sentience, living long. So something can be completely logically consistent, but if we start from like either a goal of achieving something like some kind of utility with a moral system, or if we have certain fundamental base axioms in which we value, then you can determine from there that a certain moral system is inferior to another. But you can't say that the fundamental base axioms you rely on are objective truths.
You see, the difference I think that we have here is the fact that I say that all of our axioms are based on maximizing or minimizing pain, and that the the reason that's the reason why we develop them, and the overall greatest ethical society is that one that does that. But also, when you let's say compare two societies, one will always be better than the other objectively because of this pain and pleasure response. So whether everyone wanted to join, why would they want to join, let's say, a society of murderers or not? The society of pacifists is better. Whether
That's it. That's if you have certain fundamental base axioms that you're following, or if you have like certain personal preferences. There are some people who'd rather live in a society of murderers.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, if we say that everyone's subjectivity was taken into account and they were all murderers, and if they didn't murder, they'd kill themselves, then yeah, it's better for them to kill each other. But so long as the society can be um, can express the subjective interests of individuals to a greater extent, then that will always be the best ethical system, regardless of the individual's preferences. And I mean the single individual's preference.
Okay,
So
and here, like, look, this is a normative system. So like you're going away from meta ethics and you're actually talking about like normative systems. And that's the problem with this debate. I don't think you realize that you are actually using fundamental base axioms that like you can't justify. Like it's like saying, okay, well, 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, well, what's 1? Why is like the value of
well,
1?
I said I gave
Why
I
is 2
gave you a
ones?
value of 1, and the value of 1 is
Well, no, well, listen.
the determined will of the indeterminate will of the
Well, no,
of
listen, listen. Like if we were to create a mathematical system, and I said 1 + 1 = 2, and then you could argue, okay, well, why does 1 + 1 = 2? Why can't it equal 3? And then you say, well, that's just how I'm going to make the mathematical system. It's the easiest to work with. It's
No,
like
but
it's
what you've
just
done is
easier
you've
to.
abstracted all maths from the universe. Now, if you apply that to the universe
No, no,
and you have
listen.
an endpoint, then you say 1 rock plus 2 rocks equals 3 rocks. Well, that's empirically verifiable because I can go and see 3 rocks.
Well, no, like again, you're getting away from the point I'm making.
No,
Like,
because
no,
I
no, no.
can see the pain and pleasure
Listen,
response in the
listen,
world.
listen. So math is used to explain the universe, but let's just say there was no universe, we're just two minds thinking. Like, okay, well, we could still technically create a mathematical system.
Yeah.
We could create the concept of 1, the concept of 2, even if like two things don't exist in the universe. So like I could say, okay, 1 + 1 = 2, and then you could say, okay, well, why does 1 + 1 = 2? Like, what is 1?
I would say that would be
But
meaningless because it has no content, man.
yeah, but like you just have to start off with these base fundamental axioms on what value numbers have, and then
No,
from there,
no,
and then
you've
from
done that
there,
wrong, man.
no, and then from there you just expand out that system. So now you can get into like multiplication, division, algebra, calculus. So it's the same thing with
No,
like with the moral. No,
you've done
it's
that. You've done that wrong because maths is tested against the universe, and that's the whole point. There is an end point in which maths has been given value. It's not a concept without any content, because then it would just be random letters and numbers. Then we'd just say that like we could just put the alphabet in there, we could put some random symbols in there. It all means the same, but it doesn't mean the same because 1 + 1 = 2. Because if I was to get one object and then 2 objects within the universe, that will create 3 objects.
okay. You're just not.
No, I understand
You're
what you're
not
saying.
getting. No,
As a
you're
logical
getting away from the point I'm trying to make. You do have to make some fundamental assumptions in mathematics, some very basic base fundamental assumptions. So like let's talk about measurements then, since like just numbers themselves are kind of an issue for you. So okay, let's say what's a meter? Okay, well, a meter is this long. Okay, well, why is a meter this long? Why can't it be this long? Okay, well, let's just say a meter is this long. Let's all agree that a meter is this long. And let's also agree on certain other measurements, like a pound is this much, like this is a pound.
Yeah, okay.
So these are all, well, no, look, this is all very arbitrary, and you're making a bunch of like fundamental assumptions about what certain measurements are. It's like a standardization.
Yeah,
but from there,
that's
you can like
point,
build
man.
bridges, you can like measure torque and engines, and you can do all the shit. It's the same thing with moral systems.
What we can say then is the load a bridge can take is a fact based on and we can see this theoretically based upon the measurements we use, which are standardizations gained from experience in the world. Don't get me wrong, humans create somewhat arbitrary sounding and looking concepts. These are signs and symbols, but they ultimately are representations of a world in which we experience.
Yes, but again, things like measurements are just subjectively created. Like a meter isn't an objective fact. It's something that's subjectively created. It's very much the same thing with
but
this
a meter
discussion
has
about
no
morality.
value
No, listen.
of something.
Listen. It's very much the same thing. It's very closely related to this discussion about morality. We can agree, like if we can agree on some base principles, okay, this is good, this is bad, well-being is good, suffering is bad. It's sort of like agreeing on, okay, a meter is this long, a pound is this heavy. So if we can agree on those things, then from there we can create a normative
But
ethical
do we
system.
even, this is the thing, do we need to agree that suffering is bad, or is it just bad? That is the point. Suffering in itself is bad to all sentient beings. And subjectivity,
Why?
because well, because
Again, you have to appeal to
it's
personal
by no,
preference.
because it's by
No.
definition bad. Like if I was to, let's say I was to Google, let's say suffering, the state of ongoing pain, distress, or hardship, right?
Okay,
And then
well,
would say, why is pain, distress, and hardship bad? And then it goes from my personal preferences. I do not wish to undergo pain, distress, and hardship, right? But that's subjective when it's just me, but then it's objective when it is universalized. And this is why
okay, then now you're conflating something being universal with being objective. So
no,
that's
because
been
this
the
is
whole problem here.
no. You see, what I think the problem is that for a universal ethical system, in your case, a universalized ethical system would be one that values a particular axiom. What I'm saying is that simply the content of an individual's will that's their value interaction with the world. I think we can all agree on that. That's their sentience. That is what they have, and that is the foundation of ethics, because
Okay,
they can experience pain and pleasure, and then ultimately the culmination is the objective increase of pleasure, decrease of pain, and each ethical system is better than the other the closer it gets to that ultimate utopia of no pain, unlimited pleasure.
okay, I want to close this off.
Yeah, I think it's done now.
Let me I just want to close this off. I'll just reiterate my point, and then you can end with whatever you want. My problem with what you're saying is you're actually creating a normative ethical system. You're creating base fundamental axioms for which you don't have any deeper meaning for. Like you can't actually create an objective meta-ethical position for valuing something like sentience, well-being, pleasure. So you're just starting off with base fundamental axioms and then creating a normative system, but you're not acknowledging that. And what you're claiming is, oh no, my fundamental axioms are objective because, and then your reason for that is you're appealing to the subjective preferences of sentient beings. And then you're saying, well, yeah, they're subjective, but because it's universal, therefore it's objective, which just isn't that's just doesn't make any logical sense. Something can be universal, but be subjective. So those are the two problems I have with your argument. But you
Okay,
can
so
close with whatever you want.
okay. So I would say that um, the experiences of individuals within the world is an objective truth, and that the best overall system is the one that creates the greatest good for those individuals, which democratically have that experience. So the greatest good is the addition of those experiences, and that is an objective fact. Um, I think when you talk about universal subjectivity, I don't think you're talking about what is subjective anymore, actually. And I think we're disagreeing on whether this is a subjective or an objective system, because I think the way you use subjectivity is wrong. This isn't a feeling, a preference, or anything like that. It's based upon an empirically verifiable statement, making it a fact. So I think we do disagree, but I mean, at least we've both went vegan, you know.
Yeah.
so, so
Oh, by the way, I think Ask Yourself wants to debate you on this. So if you'd be
yeah,
interested in debating Ask Yourself, you should get in touch through Twitter.
100%. I'll be definitely game to debate. Ask yourself. I was even thinking about doing a follow up video anyway, like to try and like go through like any points that we might have missed and stuff like that, and maybe explain my points better and stuff. So I'm probably going to go through this debate, and then hopefully like I'll be able to put the point better to him anyway. So
Okay, sure,
like
great.
yeah.
Okay,
But thanks for the heads up anyway, and thanks for the opportunity again, Richard. It's been a
yeah,
pleasure.
no problem.
Definitely been a difficult debate.
Yeah, and I'll leave a link to your channel, Perspective Philosophy, in the description afterwards, and I'll upload this to my main channel after a few hours.
All right, yeah. Thank you very much, man,
Okay,
and
great, no
have a nice
problem.
day.
You too,
Take it
man.
easy.
And I'm just going to take a look at the super chats in here. Let me see. A few people left super chats. Where do you go to the goddamn control room? I know a few people left super chats. God damn it. That is so weird. Usually there's a link for the control room.
Yeah,
Just
it's at the side of mine. Like it's in the corner. Like I can see it. I just can't get on it.
oh, is it in?
Like it's like at the bottom
No,
side of
like there
mine.
should be. Okay, wait. No, there should be a control room on the like on YouTube itself where I
Oh
can
yeah,
actually
on
see
YouTube
the.
itself. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Let me see. I don't want. Okay, there we go. I just had to refresh the page. It wasn't showing up. Okay, so I did get a few super chats. Rusty Richardson donated 10 pounds. He says, any carnists want to take on vegan gains, he has 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you, so you would be one stupid motherfucker to even try. All I've tried and failed. Ha 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 ha. All right, well, thanks for the compliment, Rusty Richardson, and appreciate the donation. Eric Soto donated $2. He says TO simulation theory, hashtag poop is sentient, hashtag don't flush. Do you know anything about TO simulation theory?
No.
Okay, I've never heard of that, but thanks, Eric Soto, and I guess, yeah, poop is sentient, apparently. So thanks for that. Endress plays, donated £2. He says, I'm vegan, that's all I have to say. Well, thanks for sharing that, Enderson, or Endress.
Well done.
Appreciate the donation. And Bazaboo donated $5. He says, 2018 is the year vegans turn into bulldozers. I think it's been a pretty huge friggin' year for veganism, especially with the What the Health documentary. That was pretty massive. But yeah, thanks for everyone who donated in the super chat, and thanks again for perspective philosophy for doing this debate.
Yeah,
And
it's been
hopefully
great,
we
man.
can set up a debate with Ask Yourself soon as well.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
100%.
all right. So thanks everybody, and have a good day.
Yeah, see you later.